Science on Surfaces.
Hello there and welcome to this podcast, Science on Surfaces, Tips, Tricks and Tools with me, Biolin Scientific. So today we will be talking about some practical aspects of data collection and experimental design. And we will in particular focus on how to set up and run a QCM-D measurement. So we will discuss what's important to consider for the measurement to be successful, why these aspects are important, and what will be the consequence if these aspects are ignored. And I think even though we will be focusing on QCM-D measurements in particular, some of the principles that we will be discussing will be relevant also for other types of analysis of surfaces and interfaces. So here with me in this call, I have my colleague Jennie Ringberg, Technical Product Manager of QSense here at Biolin Scientific. So welcome, Jennie.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Yes. So how are you today?
I'm fine, thanks. Hope you are fine as well.
I am, indeed.
Yeah.
Looking forward to this conversation. So we actually started at Biolin Scientific at the same time, you and I know that you've had a few different roles over the years. Today you're the Technical Product Manager for QSense, but what did you do before you started at Biolin? You have a background in science, don't you?
Yes, that's true. I have a Master of Science in Bioengineering from Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg. And after finishing my studies, I started working for a biotech company focusing on membrane proteins. And I worked there for 5 years, and actually that was where I had my first contact with QCM-D. So I started as a customer, and then I started working for Biolin. And I started actually as an application specialist for QSense brand then.
Mm. So you've long experience using the QCM-D technology, I could say.
Yeah, time passes quickly, so yeah, It's been a few years.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to today's topic, data collection and experimental design and the practicalities around setting up and running a QCM-D measurement. So if we just start with the different steps involved in a measurement setup and execution, I know you split the procedure into like 5 steps. So if you could just take us through which those steps are to start with.
Yeah, sure. So first you would prepare your sensor surface, and that's a crucial step. And then you prepare your sample liquids, also very important. And then you would set up your measurement, you would run your experiment, and then you would have some after measurement activities. So that's the division we kind of do.
Yeah. So if we just go through those 5 steps one by one, what's important and what you need to do and what to consider and so on. So you said preparing the sensor surfaces. What do you need to think about in that step?
Well, there are a few things, and I would like to emphasize that this is really crucial, since the sensor is kind of the heart of the technology. It's the center of it all. So you need to consider, first of all, what sensor surface is relevant for your study. So actually, what do you want to mimic from the real world? Let's say you're interested in a molecule binding to a cell membrane. Then, of course, ideally you would have the cell membrane on the sensor. But if that's not possible, maybe you try to coat your sensor with a bilayer that is mimicking the real membrane then. So that's the first thing to consider. And then also you can have different scenarios, because sometimes the sensor itself is the signal reporter, so to speak. And sometimes you use the film on top of the sensor as a signal reporter.
So the bilayer, for example.
Exactly, the bilayer would maybe be the signal reporter of what's happening. And I mean, in that case, maybe it's not crucial if you are using gold or silica or some other surface, as long as your film is stuck on the surface, so to speak. So yeah, you need to consider what situation you are looking at. And also you need to think about, of course, what solutions to use, because maybe the solutions you want to use will change the surface you're looking at. So make sure that you don't change the surface properties of the sensor surface. At least you should be aware if they do. So that's something to consider as well. And I guess we will talk about this throughout the whole talk today, but I mean, you need to work with clean sensors, and this is where it starts. You need to have a clean sensor surface as soon as you want to mount it in the instrument. And since QCM-D is such a sensitive technology, I mean, that's one of the strengths, but also it kind of means that it's a challenge because it's so crucial that everything is clean. You don't introduce contaminants in any of the steps. It starts with the sensor, I would say.
So what does clean mean in this context?
Well, yeah, clean. It's really more clean than you maybe work with clean normally. And I would say, for instance, when you get the sensor shipped from us, they are of course clean in the normal way of looking at it, but still they have been, stored in a box in air for maybe a couple of weeks before you get them. And already there you might have contaminants from the air. That could be dust, hydrocarbons, for instance. So those kind of contaminants also needs to be removed before you start your experiment to make sure that you get a good or high reproducibility.
So, I mean, kind of a stupid question, I guess, but maybe there is dirt that you don't really see. You mentioned hydrocarbons, for example. You would never know that they are there.
No, exactly. You can't see all this dirt with your eyes only. So, yeah, you need to be really careful about not introducing contaminants of any kind.
So making sure the sensor is clean. I know we recommend pre-cleaning protocols for some of our sensors.
Exactly.
So what could that be that you need to do in order to pre-clean your sensor?
Yeah, and I also want to just stop because you say pre-cleaning, and that's key in this, because quite often we get a question how you remove the samples from the sensors to be able to reuse them.
After a measurement, you mean?
After a measurement, exactly. And we really do not recommend doing that. So pre-cleaning is one thing. That's really important thing to do. But cleaning after an experiment to be able to reuse the sensor is nothing we recommend, because of course we can only guarantee the quality of the sensors when they leave us, when they're new. So when you get them from us, we can say that this is a good sensor, we know what's on top of the surface and so on. But if you use it once and you try to remove the sample, maybe you're not completely successful, so you might have some leftovers from the old sample. You might even change the chemical composition and their surface roughness. So in the next experiment, then you don't start with the same surface, and then you cannot expect high reproducibility. So that's just something I want to say, because it's such a common question from customers. But going back to pre-cleaning, as you said, it's an important step because it might be contaminated already from air. And then we have some different protocols that we have evaluated that we can suggest for some different sensors that we know that the sensor can withstand and so on. And that is something you can find in the product information sheet for the different sensors, and also we have a document with some different or with these suggested protocols for the sensors. So pre-cleaning, that could mean, for instance, if you have a gold surface, the standard recommendation would be a UV ozone step to start with, and then a wash with ammonia and hydrogen peroxide mix that you heat. And then after drying the sensor again, you can put it in the UV ozone chamber again. So that would be one of the standard protocols Another one that could be useful for the silica sensor, for instance, especially if you're working with proteins or lipids, you can soak it in a 2% SDS solution. And also you can have these UV ozone steps both before and after the detergent wash. So that's a few examples.
So protocols that are tailored to the specific sensor coating material.
Exactly.
And also the kind of dirt that you could expect be there, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. But not recommended to use like removing sample after an experiment. Say that again.
Yeah, it's good. Yes, so is that all steps to perform and to consider in the sensor preparation phase of the measurement setup?
Yeah, I think we covered most of it at least. Maybe I've forgotten something, but no, I think those are the key steps, key things to consider.
There was actually one thing that you mentioned earlier, that you select the sensor and then you need to be aware of if there is an interaction with, I don't know, the solvent or whatever you said, that make sure the sensor is stable in whatever solvent you're using. How do you know if that's the case or not?
Well, I mean, if you're adding thiol solution to gold, maybe you know that that will be affected. The gold sensor will be affected by it. Also, you need to consider like the chemical compatibility. If you're working with a material on the sensor that is not compatible with this, I don't know, organic solvent, maybe, then don't include that in your measurement. So you need to just know your material, I think, to some extent.
Exactly.
Especially if you're moving away from like PBS buffer and those standard ones.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on then to the next step, preparation of sample liquids. So what do you need to do there?
Yeah, here there are quite a few things again to consider. First of all, if you're working in a lab and you're including like a new solution of any kind, consider any safety regulations associated with this liquid. So check out the MSDS sheet. But then you need to think about what we just also touched upon, the chemical compatibility. So you need to make sure that the solutions you want to use in your experiments are compatible with the instrument and all the parts in there. And I mean, we have like O-rings and a gasket maybe, and also the pump tubing that are kind of the things you need to consider. The rest of the instrument is really resistant. But then it's good to know, of course, that we have high resistant versions of both O-rings and tubings. But then you would need to be aware and change accordingly. So chemical compatibility. And then, never use like old buffers and solutions. Prepare them so that you use them fresh.
And what is old?
Old?
Is it like every day you need to make new ones every day?
I mean, depends on the solution you're using. If you're working with a PBS buffer, if we take that example again, then bacteria like to grow in it. So for that one, it might be a shorter time of freshness than like, I don't know, some other solution where bacteria don't like to grow. So just to make sure it's not growing in it, and you can't see particles and stuff, so that it's fresh enough. Hard to say. And then also another thing that could really affect the results of your measurement is what we talk about as bulk effect. So if you're working with like solution and maybe buffer A, and then you change to buffer B, which has a completely different viscosity and density, you would see a large shift in your curves. And maybe if you have added a sample in the second one, you interpret that as, wow, something is absorbing, this is what's happening. But what you might see then is just the effect of changing the bulk liquid. with different properties.
So now during the measurement, I mean, this is not in the preparation.
No, exactly. But if you know about that effect, you need to think about it in advance as well.
Right.
When you're kind of designing your experimental design and your measurement.
So how would you address that if you know that I need these two different buffers or these two different
Absolutely.
solvents?
That could be the situation. And maybe my first suggestion would be, let's say you have your baseline buffer A, you add your sample if possible in buffer A, and then you rinse with A again. And then if you need to switch, you can, after this rinse step, go to buffer B, which will give a bulk effect. And then move on from there. So that you don't go from this adsorption step directly to B. Then you cannot really say much about the complete adsorption.
Right. Yeah. I know you could also do like a buffer sequence or like a solvent sequence in the beginning with just the bare surface.
Yeah, to know what the shift will be from the different. Yeah, that's true.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
To have something to relate to.
Maybe. Yeah, like a reference.
Is there anything else to consider?
Yes. I'm not finished.
No.
Other things, I mean, sometimes you have your maybe buffer or whatever solution in the fridge, and then you just remove it and start running your measurement, but that will not be great, because you should always let your solutions equilibrate in temperature, because otherwise, I mean, introducing temperature variation is not good for your QCM-D measurement. That can be seen in the signal. So please try to kind of have the solution temperature as close as possible to the measurement's temperature. And make sure not to heat the solution in the instrument. That's also a thing to consider when you plan your experiment. Because if you heat the solution, you will create bubbles inside of the instrument. And as we say, bubble means trouble. So try to avoid heating. Then it's better to have the solution a couple of degrees above, actually, to cool it slightly. So when planning, consider this. If you have particles, like we mentioned before, in your solution or sample, you might need to filtrate or centrifuge your sample, because particles won't work well in the measurement.
And what do you mean by particles? Because maybe the particles are actually what you're interested in measuring.
Yeah, and if so, you can't really avoid it. But if there are like aggregates or something that you could remove actually, or I know that when you're working with detergents, for instance, there are particles that you can actually see, and those should not be introduced on the sensor. That would kind of ruin your measurement.
Right. So if there are particles or aggregates that you are not interested in analyzing as such, but they are just there.
Yeah, exactly.
Then they should be removed if possible.
Yeah, if possible, yeah. At least you should think about it. Do they need to be there, or can you remove them? And talking about particles or similar, another thing to consider is also like the stability of your solutions. Like if you're working with proteins, they have, of course, a tendency to degrade, especially if you increase the temperature. And if you then have the results from a native protein, and then you compare it with the results from a sample where the proteins have denatured or degraded somehow or aggregated, the results will be very different. So maybe you have the mix of a native and degraded one, and you compare it to native, it could be really different results, even though you think you have the same sample.
How can you tell? Can you?
I mean, having the same state of the sample would be a good start. I mean, having a fresh solution that has been treated the same way every time, so that you don't let, like you start one day and then you let a week pass and then you run your second measurement. because then it's not considered the same sample anymore. And also when we're talking about proteins, it might be good to know that if you're working with, for instance, proteins, a macromolecule, you can't really expect the molecule to bind in the same way at all concentrations, because sometimes they arrange differently depending on concentration in the sample. So that's also a good thing to keep in mind when planning for your experiments.
Pay attention to the concentration that you're using.
Exactly. And if you see differences when you have changed the concentration, it might be like one of the reasons that actually they will rearrange differently.
What's a good concentration, by the way? Do we have any recommendations on that?
I mean, it's really hard to give a universal answer for that, because it depends on the kind of sample and so on. But if the concentration is too low, maybe you won't see the signal at all. And if you're looking at like the kinetics of a process, maybe it will be too slow. But also, if it's too high, maybe kind of the process of absorption, for instance, might be hidden in more of a bulk effect. So somewhere in between would be the ideal.
Yeah, because there you also pointed to an important aspect, that if you have a really high sample concentration, you may see a bulk shift just due to that fact, even though it's still in buffer A. You're using the buffer A, as you mentioned earlier.
True.
But you have a very high protein concentration, for example.
Absolutely.
So a lot of things to consider.
Yes.
Is there anything else related to the preparation of sample liquids that we didn't mention yet?
I think we covered most of it. Maybe I will think about something else later on, but yeah.
So the next step, step number 3, then would be to set up the measurement.
Yeah.
So what do we do there?
I would recommend that the first thing you do when you set up your measurement is that you mount your sensor and let it start the temperature equilibration in baseline buffer as soon as possible. Because as we talked about before, the temperature will affect the signal. So as long as you have an equilibration process of temperature going on in the sensor, there will be some change in the signal. And sometimes you can interpret this as a drift, actually, because I can mention this. We measure the temperature in the Peltier element, and that is actually like 2.5 centimeters underneath the sensor. Which means that if you look at the temperature curve, it might look like we are already there. We have reached the set temperature. But actually then the sensor temperature might be a bit delayed, There is a delay in reaching the right temperature. And then you can still watch this kind of drift. You could interpret that as a drift, but there is actually an equilibration in temperature going on, which is natural, so to speak. It's nothing wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just a bit delayed to what you actually see on the screen.
Yeah, so this is when the instrument is reaching the set temperature, which is different from the temperature in the room. So you start by setting the temperature that you want to measure at, which could be, different from room temperature.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And how long does this take to reach the set temperature?
Well, of course, that depends on the difference in room temperature and set temperature. So it's really hard to say, but I mean, quite depending on what you work with. If you work around room temperature, it's a quick thing. If you want to work at like 37 degrees, it takes longer. I cannot say minutes. I mean, can't specify it better than that.
But at least start the equilibration procedure as soon as possible.
As soon as you can. Yeah, exactly. Set the temperature of the instrument and mount the sensor. Start running the buffer over the sensor so that it can start to equilibrate. That's the best you can start with, I think.
Okay, is that all in setting up the measurement? Or is there anything else there? It's the equilibration, and basically then you just have to wait for the baselines to be stable.
Exactly, and that we can also mention that if the baseline is not stable, then you shouldn't start your measurement. Because if you have like a drift in either way and you start your measurement result doesn't really say much, because you don't know, would that drift continue throughout the measurement, the same slope and everything? Maybe not. And then what happened, you don't know how to interpret the data. So I would really like to emphasize that let the baseline be stable before you start your experiment.
And what is a stable baseline is
Yes.
then the obvious question, I guess.
Exactly. And in a way that can depend on what your measurement will be like. So let's say you want to measure something that you know maybe will give a rise to a shift of 3 hertz. So you study something small happening. Then of course it's more crucial that you have a perfectly stable baseline than if you expect a frequency shift of 300 hertz. Then maybe a drift of 1 hertz wouldn't really be crucial. So it's kind of your needs that sets a limit for what is a good baseline.
Yeah.
But good enough for you. You shouldn't see that there is a huge drift going on.
No. And what do you do if the baseline doesn't stabilize? How long is reasonable to wait? And what do you do if it's...
It's a good question. And sometimes if you have an ongoing drift, if the temperature, is stable since long, so you know that that's not the case, that we have this temperature equilibration going on, and you still have a drift, maybe if the frequency is decreasing, you might then suspect that you have some contamination somewhere, maybe, so that something is actually absorbing onto the sensor, and that is what you see. So it's actually something happening, it's not a drift. We actually have a process going on, and that could be, from the tubing, the inlet tubing maybe might contain some contaminants that then adsorbs to the surface. If you have a positive trend in the frequency curve, then it could be perhaps that you have something on the surface already when you start, it wasn't clean enough, and that thing, whatever it was, might be removed. So that is actually what you see then happening. But then, you can discuss maybe that should stop eventually if it's just a small amount of contaminant that is being removed. Maybe it will, stabilize over time. But here again, we come back to cleanliness. Make sure that you don't have to worry about this. Make sure to have clean equipment and sensors and tweezers and everything that you work with. And sometimes you see a problem having a stable baseline, and that could actually also be air in the system. But then maybe it's not a slope in your baseline like that, but maybe you have like jumps and weird behavior in general, and that could actually be air causing this. And
I guess also coming back to something that you mentioned earlier, that if you haven't really paid attention to maybe the solvent compatibility with the surface, maybe you have the coating dissolving or reacting with the solution, maybe a reaction that you're not aware of. So then you could see, I guess, both uptake and loss.
Yeah. And also, if it's not compatible with the O-ring that surrounds the sensor, that could also be seen in the signal. And so that's why it's so important to consider these things before you start your measurement. Yeah.
So let's move on to running the measurement. I know there are a lot of details on how to collect, quality data and so on. I think we will save that discussion for another episode because there is so much to talk about related to that. But if we just go on to, the best practice in collecting the data as such for the setup, what should you keep in mind and do?
Yes. Well, this maybe goes back to also planning the experiment in some sense. So again, the different steps that you include in your measurement should be it should be designed in a clever way, your measurement, so that you consider these things of going back to the first solution to avoid the bulk effects, for instance. You can also consider maybe using the same sensor for different purposes, different kinds of analysis, like if you're working, let's say in the detergent industry, again, maybe you can use the same sensor first to study the soil removal from the sensor, and in the same experiment you can just continue to study etching of the same sensor as the stain has been removed.
Right.
So you can design it in a clever way, and you always need to ask yourself, like beforehand, what kind of information do you want to extract from your data, so that you also always start thinking like from the beginning to like the data analysis, because if you want to analyze your data somehow, you need to really consider what to include in the measurement to be able to extract that information.
And I guess that's the whole point, to be able to get some information out, right?
Exactly. So, but you shouldn't like start thinking about that when you have run your measurement. You need to consider this in an early stage. But like practical things that you can get some tips from this podcast, and like we talked about having air in the system, for instance. If you have mounted your sensor correctly, and if you have your like volume above the sensor completely free of air, then you can see that both the F and D1, like the fundamental curves, should then resemble the higher harmonics.
Okay.
So that's kind of a quality check in some sense, that it's correctly mounted and that there is no air disturbing.
You mean so during the measurement, all the harmonics should have sort of the same shape?
Same shape, yeah, exactly, the same looks.
Mm.
And if you have this situation where everything was mounted correctly and there is no air, you can also take a look at the values of the dissipation, the absolute values, to get some guidance that this is correct. That's also like a quality check, and it might be good to know this. If you check the absolute value of D3, so the third harmonic for dissipation, in air at 20 degrees, then you should have a value of approximately 165 dissipation units if the sensor is clean.
In air?
In air, that is. And if you go to deionized water instead, it's approximately 181. And I mean, this is a good check, because normally when you have mounted your sensor and you look for the frequencies and so on, you get these numbers. And if you see already in air that this dissipation value is absolutely far away from 165 for the third harmonic, then you can start suspect that there is something wrong. Maybe it's not correctly mounted, maybe it's not clean. So you have a first indication before you have filled your instrument or a system with liquid and so on, because starting all over then is a bit more messy. You need to dry everything and it takes more time. So as a first quality check, you can start by looking at these values.
So this is something that you have to do before you start your temperature equilibration.
Yeah,
it's the first thing that you do when you mount the sensor.
So this would be setting up the measurement with finding the resonances and stuff, if you're working with a Explorer and analyzer. That's true. So it's a very early stage, like a quality check before you start running buffer to temperature equilibrate.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, but that's good. So we have then two quality checks. One related to the dissipation in air compared to deionized water, and then also the shape of the curves during the measurement.
Yeah.
Anything else to keep in mind during the measurement when you're running?
Well, during the measurement, I would really recommend that you, as a user, take notes in the software, and you can also use this function of making a timestamp. And especially, I mean, this is good in general, but of course, it's maybe even more useful if you plan to use Define to analyze your data afterwards. Then this is really useful.
So the timestamp is actually a button in the software.
Exactly. You press this
press
button
it,
to get a timestamp. Now
and
I
then-
inject this solution or whatever you want to know afterwards.
Yeah, it's good to take notes.
It is.
So you know what you have done
Yeah.
during the measurements. Okay, so maybe that's it for the actual measurement execution.
Yeah, I think so.
And now you've run your measurement, you've saved the data, and then you may think, that's it, I'm done. But now you have the fifth step, the after measurement.
Yes.
Yes.
We mentioned it before. It's crucial to keep everything clean, which means that after your measurement, you should really pay attention to the cleaning of the instrument, so that you or the next user will start with a clean instrument, so that we never have leftovers from your sample there, because that would, of course, potentially at least destroy the next data. But what we can say then is also here that we have like recommended cleaning protocols for the instruments in the same document that I mentioned before, cleaning document. And a tip here could be that you use one of your old sensors as a cleaning sensor. So you mount that one in the system after you have run your measurement. And with this cleaning sensor mounted, you can run your cleaning solution in the system without like ruining a new sensor, because potentially, of course, this cleaning solution could somehow affect the sensor by etching it or something. So then we run this cleaning solution through the system for a long time or whatever time, and then we rinse with deionized water to make sure it's clean. And depending on system, you might need to dry some parts afterwards. Like if you're working with a flow module, it should be dry afterwards. So, yeah.
What is the cleaning solution? It sounds like it's harsh.
We recommend Hellmanix for cleaning of the Explorer and Analyzer, at least. So that's a detergent that we have evaluated that works well with this instrument. And don't use a new sensor for it, because it could be affected. And then again, I mean, after the measurement, you clean your instrument, you make sure all the equipment is cleaned, like tweezers and so on could also be good to clean. And those can actually, like tweezers can be cleaned if you use this protocol that we recommend for the gold sensor. And we call it the TL1 wash, the one with ammonia and hydrogen peroxide. So then you can just clean the tweezers in there, because of course that can be like a source of contamination as well.
The tweezers.
Yeah, because you use those for moving the sensors and mounting stuff. And then, I mean, saving your data file in a good way, in a structured way, so that you know where to find what data and so on. Because the next step would then be to go to data analysis, and that's not really included in this topic, but everything that we've done so far is like preparing for the data analysis to optimize the chances of having a good experience there.
Yes.
So, yeah.
That's well stated. To have a good experience with the data analysis.
Yes.
That's something we want.
Yeah.
So those were the 5 steps. Is there anything else that's important to consider that we didn't mention so far? Trying to think.
Yeah, what I can mention, and we briefly touched upon that, is like the O-rings and gaskets in the flow module. These are made out of a rubber material, and this material will of course be affected by time, so it will age. So I mean, it will dry eventually, and there can be cracks, so we can have leakage due to this. And I would like to mention that these should be exchanged every now and then when needed, depending on what solutions you use and how you use it. Or at least annually is what we say, because this can affect your quality of your data.
Is there some way that you can tell if they are ruined or old or so before the year has passed?
I mean, to start with, I would recommend that you always do this visual check.
Okay.
So you take a look at it, maybe use a tweezer to just push the O-ring a bit to see that it's not full of cracks or something, that it behaves normally. It feels like, rubberish, so that it's still in good shape.
Right. Yeah, and related to this, because you mentioned the cleaning, you mount the sensor and you run the Hellman X or whatever solution you're using and so on. But then I guess you take everything apart, you dry it.
Yeah.
Is this the point where you will be checking the O-rings?
Yeah.
I mean, would you disassemble everything after the measurement or?
Yeah, I mean, I would never leave like the sensor in the module. If we're talking about, again, Analyzer and Explorer, you want to take the module apart, remove the sensor, which would be then at the end the cleaning sensor. You can dry that one, put it back in your cleaning box, and then clean the module. And then you also clean the O-ring. And then that's a perfect time to just check that it's in a good shape.
So what do you do with the O-ring then when you clean it?
When I clean it,
do you do something separate after each measurement? Do you clean the O-rings in a separate way?
No, I mean, I think they can just go with a normal cleaning procedure and then just dry it after finishing.
Okay.
So make sure to dry it.
Dry everything. Okay. Great.
And of course, I can mention that your systems should also be like serviced every now and then to make sure that we have this good quality data.
Yeah.
So, cleanliness, exchange consumables, and service your system. Those are 3 like key things as well to make sure we have this good results that we want in the end for data analysis.
Exactly. Really, how do you say, have like a great, good sort of foundation for a good measurement.
Yeah.
For measurements to be successful, so to say. Yeah. Great. So if our listeners would like to learn more about this or find this information that you've just mentioned, what should they do?
Then I would refer you to our website, biolinscientific.com. And also, I mean, if there's something you think you don't find there, you can, of course, always get in contact with us. But you find a lot of useful stuff there, so please take a look at it.
Great. So I think we will end with that. Thanks for sharing all this useful information on how to run a successful QCM-D measurement.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So thanks for listening to this episode with me, Malin Edvardsson and Jennie Ringberg. And I would also like to take the opportunity to mention to those of you who are listening or watching that if you're interested in surface and interface science or related topics, you should check out our blog, the Surface Science blog. Thank you.
Thank you.